Good morning, everyone. How's everyone doing? Having a good conference? Very good. Well, my name is Paul Ortiz. I'm director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program and associate professor of history at the University of Florida. Welcome to our American Historical Association panel, What It Means to be a Citizen, Student Veterans in History Classrooms. We're so delighted that you're here. Other folks will undoubtedly come in. We want to get started, though, for the interest of time. I want to start out by talking just real briefly about what kind of brings us together. And as is the case with most things worthwhile in academia, this panel is the result of a very creative and meaningful collaboration. It comes from a wonderful essay that Eladio Bobadilla wrote for last January's Perspectives on History. The piece was titled, of course, What It Means to be a Citizen, Student Veterans in History Classrooms. And just out of curiosity, how many folks were able to read that piece? Excellent. So here's the author. You'll be able to hear from him in a few minutes. And he's the person that really kind of got us together initially, this group of veteran scholars that you have before you this morning. In the piece, Eladio wrote, quote, "The presence of veterans in the college classroom presents a number of opportunities as well as challenges for students, instructors, and administrators. Some of these concern all disciplines, but some are especially relevant to the humanities and specifically to history." So that's what we're going to be talking about this morning, and we're so excited that you're here with us. In the course of the piece, Eladio briefly discussed a graduate seminar at the University of Florida that I co-taught with Alice Fryfield, who I believe is going to join us a bit later this morning. In the fall of 2016 was the graduate seminar we taught. The seminar was sponsored by the National Endowment for the Humanities Dialogues on the Experience of War. That's a very important national project. I also want to acknowledge a colleague from the Library of Congress who's here with us this morning. Many of our oral history programs, museums across the country are collaborating with the Library of Congress on their Veterans History project. And I'm sure we'll talk about that a bit later in the session this morning. It's a very important project, collecting, gathering, preserving, and promoting the history of military veterans in the United States and abroad. So at the University of Florida, the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, the Center for European Studies, and UF Arts and Medicine embarked on a collaboration that resulted in a live oral history-based performance of the experiences of military veterans and one military spouse, which this came out of our NEH-sponsored project, and it was called Telling Gainesville. It was an oral history performance. It featured veterans from the American wars in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq. And it actually featured the veterans themselves telling their own stories on stage at the Actors Warehouse in Gainesville, Florida. And that was we ran that over Veterans Day weekend for 2 weekends in November of 2016. We filmed the performance, and we actually showed the film or screened the film at the Hippodrome Theater in Gainesville this past Veterans Day. Again, a standing room only performance. The chance for veterans to tell their stories, to speak their truths without mediation, if you will, to the public. So this morning, I'm going to give brief introductions of each of our speakers. This is a roundtable. We want each of the speakers to have the opportunity to tell their stories about what they see as very important issues dealing with their own experiences and wider issues in terms of the experiences of military veterans in higher education. I will briefly introduce each of them in turn. We will do a little different from the order you have in your print program. We'll have Eladio go first because we want him to talk a little bit about his piece that he wrote in Perspectives that kind of got us started off. And then we'll move from there to questions, to comments, to concerns. I know we're going to have a vibrant discussion, so I'll go ahead and start with the introduction. So first, we'll hear from Eladio Bobadilla. He is a PhD candidate at Duke University. He earned his Bachelor of Integrated Studies from Weber, thank you for giving me the pronunciation, otherwise I wouldn't have known, in 2012, where he was recognized as a College of Social and Behavioral Sciences outstanding graduate and given the university's highest academic honor for students when he was named the Crystal Crest Scholar of the Year. He enrolled at Duke University in 2013. He's received several fellowships and grants, including the Mellon Fellowship for Dissertation Research and Original Sources, the Otis Green Fellowship, a Bass Instructional Fellowship, the John Highen Research Fellowship, and the George Pizzetta Dissertation Award. He is currently writing his dissertation on the history of the modern immigrants' rights movement under the supervision of his primary advisor, Dr. Nancy McLain. Ladio, of course, is a veteran, if you read his piece in Perspectives, a veteran of the U.S. Navy. Our next speaker will be Steve Arionis. Thank you for the pronunciation, too. Steve enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps in 1998. He served in support of Operation Enduring Freedom at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba in 2002, and in support of Iraqi Freedom II in Anbar Province in 2004-2005. Honorably discharged from the Marines, Steve finished his bachelor's and master's degrees at the University of Texas in San Antonio and decided to pursue graduate studies at Michigan under his advisor, Matthew Lassiter. His dissertation is titled Amid the Shadows of Progress, analyzes the relationship between economic growth, urban inequality, and the struggle for metropolitan democracy in San Antonio from 1930 to 1990. I wish my father was here because he's a Marine Corps vet. He always loves to talk to fellow Marines, and also we have a lot of family in San Antonio.
Absolutely.
Interestingly enough. Our final speaker this morning is going to be Kate Dahlstrand. Kate is a PhD candidate at the University of Georgia. She earned her BA in English from Florida Atlantic University, where she also earned her MA in history. She is working currently under the guidance of Dr. John Insko. Her dissertation research consists of a series of case studies of Civil War veterans from East Tennessee, both Union and Confederate, as a lens for examining loyalty. She also, and we talked about this a little bit beforehand, she also collects oral histories of UGA's veterans, working with the Student Veteran Resource Center and the Oral History Department at the Russell Special Collections Library. Kate spent 10 years in the Army, 4 years active duty, and 6 years in the Virginia Army National Guard. She was a combat medic and deployed to Operation Iraqi Freedom from October 2005 to February 2007. She was diagnosed with PTSD within 24 hours of her return to the States. She became an activist shortly thereafter, and she has been interviewed, and you probably have read her piece, or she was interviewed for a number of publications, including the Washington Post. And lastly, just tell you briefly, I'm a third-generation military veteran. In retrospect, I was raised to be an NCO by a man who was an NCO, and who also, my father was actually, one of the things that people learn about him later is that he was recruited, or I learned about it later, was he was actually recruited to take part in the Bay of Pigs invasion. And my father's father fought in the Mexican Revolution. I had many uncles and other family members who fought in World War II. War was really all we knew growing up in Bremerton, Washington, a shipyard town. Everyone in Bremerton is either active duty, veteran, disabled, civil service. My sister, I talked to her on the phone last night. She was actually kind of relieved. She's in civil service. She does personnel and HR for the U.S. military, and she said in D.C. right now, because so many things are closed down, most of her military clients are in D.C., and so the workload has gone down just a little bit for her. I joined the Army after graduating from high school. I served as a paratrooper and combat radio operator in the 82nd Airborne Division and 7th Special Forces in Central America. As a sergeant in Special Forces, my responsibilities took me to multiple combat zones in Latin America during the U.S.-sponsored civil wars in that region, and today I'm an active member of Gainesville Veterans for Peace, Chapter 14. So without further delay, I will turn it over to Eladio Bobadilla.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ortiz, for your introductions, and all of you for being here this very chilly morning. So thank you. I guess I'll say a little bit about how the piece came together and how this panel came together. And it all started about a couple of years ago when I was given the opportunity to write for Perspectives, which Allison Miller was kind enough to invite me to write a piece on faculty diversity, and then later she asked me to write about just something I cared about, and something I care about is veterans and veterans in the classroom. So that was just a wonderful opportunity, and in that short piece I talked a little bit about sort of the challenges and opportunities that veterans, especially in the history classroom, face, and the sorts of things I thought we should be talking about. And interestingly, I guess as expected, after the piece came out, a lot of really interesting comments came to me that I really appreciated, because there were issues that I hadn't thought about, questions that I hadn't considered. And so when Dr. Antoinette Burton asked me to put together this panel, it was really a really exciting opportunity to sort of to have other folks come in and talk about these things that the piece just didn't get to. What the article did focus on, again, was sort of the broad experience of veterans and what they bring to the classroom, especially the history classroom, the college history classroom. And some of the challenges that I talked about in that piece, for those of you who didn't have an opportunity to read it, are just the diversity that veterans bring in a number of different senses, ethnic diversity, but also gender diversity, and we often don't think about the military as being a diverse institution, but it absolutely is. Veterans bring a certain maturity to the classroom. Steve talked about, when I interviewed him for the piece, about certain skills that veterans bring to the classroom that are really unique to veterans. And if you want to say something about that, Steve, that'd be wonderful. Critical thinking, which we always push on our students. Veterans are especially equipped to think critically. We ask young people, kids really, to go out into the world and really throw them into situations that force them to think critically. So when they come back stateside, we have an opportunity to really make use of those abilities. Also the ability to communicate clearly, to work in teams, and to just be creative. And again, we're asking young people to go to war and to think creatively about how to handle situations that most young people never have to face. But there were also a number of challenges that, some that I knew as a veteran and some that other people told me they faced. In particular, there's a sense among many veterans that there are certain stereotypes that can be really harmful when veterans come back and try to get an education. Again, just the picture of the veteran is often completely wrong. So, many of us, Dr. Ortiz, I think you mentioned this, and it's something that I know is important to you, but knowing that so many of us become members of the military because it's essentially our only opportunity to get an education, to get ahead in life. I know for myself, I could never have gone to college without the GI Bill. I was undocumented for many years, the son of migrant farm workers. So the military, for many of us, is the ticket out into the middle class, or at least is perceived as being, that ticket into the middle class. We often think of the veterans in the military as this gender institution. We think of men, and I wanted to get the perspective of someone like Kate, who breaks those stereotypes, who has probably seen and done things that most of us have never even imagined. So again, one of the points of that article was to sort of break down the stereotypes that at least veterans perceive as being problematic and being issues that they face day in and day out. Again, a lot wasn't covered, so I hope that you folks have some questions or that we can start discussions about things that I was not able to get to in that short piece. The intersection of class, gender, questions of trauma, are things that I simply could not have, explored in length in that article, but that I do hope we can talk about here. And then one other thing that I was just thinking about earlier is, so we talk about veterans coming back from war, coming back from the service, transitioning into this whole new world. But also, as history teachers, I think we have a role to play in shaping future military leaders. Folks in ROTC, for example, who are, again, just kids. I mean, they're 19, 20-year-old kids, and we're asking them to lead troops into battle. So I think it's important to talk about how we can, as history teachers, help them develop a sense of historical context, empathy, to teach them to think of the world around them in a historical way, and to become true leaders. So again, these are just sort of really broad questions that some of which I tried to discuss in the article, and some of which I just couldn't get to, but that I hope we have an opportunity to talk about. So I think that's all I'll say, and I'll hand it over to someone far more interesting than me. Well, both of these folks, really. Stephen, Kate, so who's going first? Dr. Ortiz, I think you said.
Do you want me?
Kate?
Okay.
Yeah, please.
Good morning. My name is Kate Dahlstrand, and thank you, Dr. Ortiz, for leading this roundtable, and thank you, Eladio, for putting this together. I was asked to sit on this panel as the representative of the female veteran experience. Because I am also a white, straight female, I knew that I could not speak on behalf of all female veterans, and so I've been soliciting other female veterans for the past year, trying to get some answers and get some different voices and different perspectives. And the answers I got are amazing and insightful, and I'd like to bring up some points that were highlighted to me that I think deserve some more explanation. Some of the participants have asked to maintain their anonymity, so I'm not going to give any names today. The names that the people who did give permission, I'm going to try to turn all of this into an article at some point. But one of the major points that every single female veteran turned historian turned student wanted to bring up is that this concept that women aren't real veterans, that if you were a female in the armed services, you couldn't have possibly have bore witness or participated in any kind of traumatic event unless that event was rape. That seems to be the one trauma associated with every female veteran, whether or not it actually happened. It is the one thing that all female veterans have had to have a conversation about, because if you are a female who served any amount of time in the military, it's almost automatically assumed that you have dealt with some either sexual harassment or sexual violence during your time in service. And so while that is a very real problem, and it is something that a lot of female veterans have had experience either firsthand or knowing someone else. It's not the only sort of trauma that women have experienced while in uniform. Another thing that a lot of the women I talked to wanted me to express to everyone is that not all vets are white men. Clearly, by the panel here today, we have nary a white man among us. And so that is something that people wanted to express, especially because one of the questions I asked them is, do you see yourself represented in the history you read, in the movies you watch, in the fictions that portray wartime, in televisions, in movies? And for the most part, it's a resounding no. So not only are not all veterans white men, but most female veterans do not see themselves in the stories that are told about America's wartime experiences. More people are familiar with Rosie the Riveter than any kind of female combat experience. Let's see. I talked to a couple of women who about the sort of transition that comes when you leave the service and enter academia, and I asked if, did the military offer any sort of hindrance to you when transitioning into academia? And for the most part, that answer is no. I think for older female veterans, when faculties were still filled with primarily a lot of 1960s anti-war intellectuals, veterans were suspicious until proven liberal, right? So their morality came into question because they raised their right hand, and so there was more of a stigma attached to veteran academics when faculties were populated with more 1960s anti-war protesters. I think it's commonly understood now that veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan especially are not these brainwashed, pro-combat, pro-war people. In fact, most of us, I think, would describe ourselves as activists. And that's one thing that I'd like to talk about at some point today, because as Dr. Ortiz mentioned earlier, I've been collecting oral histories of UGA veterans on my campus, and the one thing that seems to transcend whether they come back just to get the bachelor's degree, whether they're getting a degree in the humanities at all, or going off into STEM or some other branch, the people who join the military and then go to school afterwards are generally attempting to continue serving their country via other means, right? This is a life of service. And so you see people going back to school to become lawyers to help with immigration, or who become physical therapists so that they can go and work at the VA. I think that one of the positives about a military experience is that it shows you how fulfilling a life of service can be. I study the transition of the veteran throughout history because there are parallels, there are patterns. There is a history there that is worth studying, and like Eladio said, it's in those patterns that hopefully I can be able to teach future military leaders to think about the long game when, coming up with strategy or coming up with tactics, to recognize that when you create a wartime generation, you have certain responsibilities to those future veterans. And so I'll end that there. I look forward to having a broader discussion about this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Artie Salanio, for putting this together. Thank you all for coming on a very frigid morning in Washington, D.C. I want to talk a little bit, I'll talk a little bit about my own experiences, because when Eladio asked me to do, when he interviewed me for the piece, it was very sort of personal, it was a very personal reaction that I had to thinking about my own experiences as a veteran in graduate school, in higher education in general. So I'll speak a little bit about my own personal experience, and then I'll ask some questions to hopefully generate some discussion for the question and answer period. When I came back from, after I got out of the Marines in 2005, I enrolled in a history program at the University of Texas, San Antonio. And there were some transitional issues that I had to deal with. I felt very sort of lost. I don't think that first year, I don't think I said one word to anybody, whether it was a college professor, peers, anybody. You know, I was just trying to sort of reconcile coming back home and fitting into civilian society, that transition period. Certainly issues of PTSD I also had to deal with. But it was a very eye-opening experience for me. You know, in San Antonio, you can't throw a rock and not hit someone who is connected to the military. It's a military city. I think the University of Texas at San Antonio has 10% military-connected families, students who go there. The University of Michigan is a different story. I think the median income at the University of Michigan, family income, is $150,000, give or take. And I looked on a website, and I think only under 500 cases of people using the GI Bill to help pay for their education at the University of Michigan. So it's very small. The veteran community is very small at the University of Michigan. At UTSA, it's larger, but one thing I sort of found that connects the two is that history professors generally who teach the survey, and this is not a condemnation of the survey, but I feel like we don't teach war anymore. You know, if you're doing the second half of the survey, you got a lot of stuff to fit in there. And so I think when you hit World War II, most people focus on the home front, but rarely do you talk about the veteran experience. Same with Vietnam. You spent a lot of time talking about civil rights. Maybe you'll talk about returning veterans. Certainly you'll talk about the anti-war protests on the left, but rarely do you actually talk about the war itself, right? At least in my experience. I'm sure that's not indicative of everyone's experience. And I just wonder what is lost when we, as history professors, teachers, don't talk about the consequences of war. We don't talk about the battles of war. We don't talk about veteran experiences in war and coming home. And I was speaking with someone the other day, and I enlisted in 1998, and then September 11th happened, and that radically shifted everything for me in terms of my trajectory in the military. And I was talking to him, and we were talking about how kids who we served with had, after we got out, they had families of their own. And, their sons and daughters are going to be able to serve in the same conflict that their that their fathers have served in, or their brothers or sisters, right? So we're talking about generational warfare. And it seems like Afghanistan is on the back burner. No one really talks about it. And I think that's a reflection of how many families have to sort of like deal with the war itself, because it's a very small percentage of Americans actually that foot the bill of American foreign policy, right? So let me just ask some broad questions, and we'll open it up to discussion. I think as history teachers, it's important to see veterans as a potential resource to be tapped, right? Most veterans are non-traditional students. They're a little bit older. They've seen a little bit more. How can we as history teachers tap into their experiences, being sort of cognizant that not every veteran is going to be open to talking about their experiences. But if you think about Ernie Pyle, the journalist from World War II, and how he sort of humanized veterans and the veteran experience for the American public, how can we as history teachers do a similar thing? When I was at the University of Michigan, I co-taught a class on 20th century American war and experience. And, it's an undergraduate course taught by Jonathan Marwell. And inevitably, when my veteran status came up, the students, great students, they all had like questions that you could tell they wanted to ask you, but they didn't want to ask you because they didn't want to upset you. But when I was able to sort of like tell my own stories, sort of connect the history with the personal, it made for a much more rich discussion, certainly, but I think experience generally for the students in my class, at least I hope so. And so I think, as history professors or teachers, veteran history professors and teachers, we need to use veterans as a resource. How can we get universities to do more veteran outreach? When I got out of the Marines in 2005, there were very few sort of programs for veterans. I think they were just starting to come up. I think now you probably see that there's a lot more. But I wonder if there's something we can do as historians, as veterans, to sort of like generate more interest in veteran outreach. Finally, just some pedagogical questions. Again, how do we teach war in the survey? What is lost when we don't teach war? And finally, sort of the theme of this panel, what does it mean to be a citizen, right? Because I think in the United States, for most of us, the state asks so little of you to be a citizen. Maybe vote, pay your taxes, but very few people actually know what it means to serve and the sacrifice that military-connected families have to go through. And I think, I'll end it there and open up for discussion.
All right, thank you. Let's give a round of applause to our wonderful panelists. And we actually have quite a bit of time for a nice discussion, and as folks are kind of thinking about questions or comments, I'll make a few follow-up as we transition to Q&A. And one of the common themes that is coming up here is the experience of war. And it is striking how we have almost excised war from many of our history courses at a time when we're actually living in a time of permanent war. As Steve mentioned, multi-generational, where you can have children who serve in the same war potentially as their parents and as their elders. So what is that all about? The issue of trauma is very real. As a professor who's a military veteran, I have students who come to me every semester to talk one-on-one about very traumatic experiences, both in peacetime, but also in war service. And University of Florida has a very rich and very good veterans VA hospital. We don't have a lot of veterans as faculty, and this is something that I was thinking about when you all were talking. I'm just old enough. When I got out of the military in 1986, and I went back, I attended Olympic Community College in my hometown of Bremerton. I actually was in the classroom with World War II veterans who were students on the old GI Bill, because back in the day, you could go to school almost the rest of your life on the GI Bill. And I had a lot of faculty at community college who themselves were veterans. As I moved through the academy, though, that changed radically. And by the time I got to Duke University, I don't know if we had any members of the faculty who were actually veterans. This other issue I want us to think about too that's come up is memory and memorialization. So not only have we seemingly excised war, and especially the cost of war, I think this is something Kate, Eladio, and Steve all alluded to directly in their discussions. Relatively few Americans now actually serve in the military. A very large number of those are undocumented, as Eladio alluded to as well. And so what does it mean that we don't talk about the cost of war? The final thing is the issue of class, of identity, of gender, of race. For Chicano men of my generation, it's and older, it's very rare to see any of us who made it into the academy without military service as being our gateway into higher education. We didn't have resources growing up to go to college. Our parents didn't go to college. So one of the things I want us to think about is, what does it mean to be a veteran and also a first-generation college student? And then finally, as Kate mentions, what about the process of being active as scholars in documenting, in preserving and promoting the history of military service, again, whether it's in war or in peace, because you can have traumatic things happen to you in the military in peacetime. And what I mean by this is that this is a whole range of possibilities. One is, when I remember when I was in jump school in 1983, the U.S. military just carried out the largest peacetime airborne drop in American history. Took place in the Mojave. I think it was in the spring of '83. It may have been in the winter of '82, but it was a disaster. What happened was the paratroopers were dropped. The officers in charge didn't properly gauge the ground speed on the floor of the Mojave Desert. Several paratroopers were actually killed. Many were injured, drugged to their deaths. When I first arrived in the 82nd Airborne in 1983, a number of helicopter crashes had taken place, and many people have been killed or were killed. And so there's a lot of traumatic things that happen to people even when you're not in war. So that's something to think about as well. But without further delay, do we have questions or comments that folks have? Yes. And if you want to address yourself and let us know who you are. And by the way, we are being recorded. And then just identify yourself. Thank you.
Well, first I would suggest that, there's still a backdoor draft. So one of the things that is not made perfectly clear when folks enlist is that they owe the government 8 years, whether they sign on for 2 or for 8. And I deployed with a lot of people who had been home out for years, and then they got a phone call and said, hey, you need to report. So I think that one of the biggest misconceptions is that the draft did end, because it just changed how it takes effect, but there's still, if the government wants to call you back, they still can. And I think that that's something that ought to be related to people. I don't think people recognize that the backdoor draft is still very active.
Well, to answer that question, or partially answer it, James Fallows, he writes, he's a writer now, a prolific writer, but he has some very good pieces on Vietnam, right? Jonathan Marwell at the University of Michigan teaches this class. It's a fantastic class. He's one of the best lecturers I've ever known. And he has this lecture on who fights, right? Who fights our wars? And we read this piece by James Fallows. I think it was James Fallows and maybe someone else. But it was talking about Vietnam and sort of the class composition of soldiers in Vietnam. And people like, he was talking, was it James? I don't know who it was, it doesn't matter. The author was talking about how he, from Harvard, avoided the draft, right? And he was talking about the folks from the inner city who weren't able to sort of like dodge the draft as he and his compatriots from Harvard did. They found loopholes or exceptions, or whatever the case may be. And I think when we taught that in our class, it resonated with a lot of Michigan students, especially because, very few Michigan, it surprised me, very few Michigan families actually have someone who has, or at Michigan, who has fought or served in the military. The military is not an avenue that most Michigan students, I think, see as a viable career path. And that was totally, fundamentally different from my own experience. I grew up working class, and like a lot of you said, like the military for me was a way out. And I know I don't have a good answer to your question, but I think it's one that we need to sort of pose and continually address as historians.
Yes.
So I think one of the things we haven't talked about too is the class dimension within the military. So the people that you and I know, Ashton, that are getting their PhDs at Duke or anywhere else, are usually officers, mid-career officers. So they're people who are career military and who are solid middle class folks, and their experiences are certainly unique in another way. And we have a lot to learn from them, and they have a lot to teach us. But we also have to keep in mind that the folks who are in that position are very different from, as you say, from some of our experiences, some working class people who enlisted rather than became officers, so who saw it as an opportunity to serve, and then I think most working class people aren't career military. They serve to find their way into the middle class. So I think that's one of the questions that we never talk about too. Is one of the issues we never talk about is when we talk about veterans, we're talking about a lot of different things. We're talking about women's experiences, we're talking about working class experiences, we're also talking about people who did have more opportunities and who were able to serve in different capacities. So I'm not sure if that gets at your question, but I did think that it was worth talking about the class dimension within the military.
I've worked with some people who are taking that break for an accelerated program, and it's interesting because, like Eladio said, there does seem to be a class discrepancy between the veteran turned historian and the soldier transitioning into an academic officer. One of the commonalities, though, is that we speak the same language. I think we are asking similar questions of our source material. We are trying to bring our military experience and allow it to inform the questions we ask of sources, the questions we ask of our research topics. And it also, I think the biggest difference you see is where they gravitate towards as far as research fields, because you see a lot of the enlisted people looking at class, looking at race, looking at gender, looking at the things that compelled themselves to join the military in the first place. Whereas you might see the officer side go more towards like looking at management, looking at imperialism, looking at colonialism, looking at it from top-down perspectives. One thing that I do think is interesting from one of the women I talked to who's doing this exact same accelerated program, she talked about how the biggest difference between studying history and being active duty military is the fact that you are dealing with different levels of context. So she calls the military a very low context experience, that officers give orders, enlisted get very little background or explanation or explication of why they're doing something. They're just told and then they follow orders. Whereas when you enter the field of history, it is nothing but context. So it's a low context culture entering a high context culture. And that seems to be one of the most striking differences between the two.
But I think we can learn from both experiences, right? Or all experiences. I think that's part of the theme of this discussion is that, you know, not every military service member comes from the working class. I know, even in my own unit, there's, a friend of mine, he's the son of, not a hedge fund manager, but like, he's very well off, but he decided to serve because he wanted to serve his country out of a sense of duty. I know a lot of officers who, you know, come from middle class, upper middle class families, but join the military for a sense of service as well. And so I think the takeaway I got from these questions is, you know, we need to sort of like harness like all of those experiences, right? Because our military isn't monolithic. And although the enlisted side may be overwhelmingly middle class, I don't know, they're not exclusively, right? And so we can't elide these class differences. I don't know.
You know, if I can just add to that, I mean, I was an enlisted person, and my generation in becoming an NCO, a sergeant, we were very disobedient. We always disobeyed officers. And because when you're in, you know, when you're in combat areas, especially in undeclared wars in Central America, some of the orders we were given, if we would have followed those, would have cost us our lives. And so we had to exercise, I mean, today I teach labor history at the University of Florida. I grew up in working class, but I will tell you, I think I really learned about class conflict more in the military, perhaps, than even growing up. I learned a craft, a skill, being a radio operator. I also learned what to do when officers pushed too hard on the men. At the time, we were all men. We found ways to fight back, and usually not openly, because those could lead to Article 15 or court-martial, but sabotage. We engaged in a lot of things that you would associate with the old IWW, the old Wobblies. And very few of us were radical. I wasn't radical when I was in the Army by any stretch of the imagination. But conflict, tensions, incredible diversity. I mean, that's one of the things I think that military veterans, whether or not they serve in war or peace or both, that they really bring into the classroom a very nuanced, I love the term context, high context, low context, because I think my military experience had all of those, kind of all of the above. Low context, one, you're sent out to do something. One time, I remember the first time I was told, leave your dog tags in the barracks. If you get caught or if you get into a hard situation, sorry, but you're on your own. There will be no airstrike or medevac or anything to bail you out. And so once you learn that, your entire relationship to your country changes. We talk about the meaning of citizenship. And veterans have those types of experiences, not just in Central America, but even during Vietnam. I've interviewed helicopter pilots involved in extraction in Laos, and they were told the same thing that we were told in Central America. Leave your dog tags at home. If you get caught behind the lines, sorry about that. And we don't like to talk about that today, but that's been the experience of many veterans. So think about those incredibly diverse and fraught experiences that our students bring, whether they're officers, and I don't want to cast aspersions on all officers, right? But you're right. I mean, Steve is exactly right. You can't just kind of cast officers and enlisted people and non-commissioned officers as kind of stereotypes, because there's a tremendous diversity. Yes, you tell us where you're from. And
Hi, my name is Drew Darian, and I'm from Salem State University. I've been teaching a first-year learning community for veterans, and for the past decade, I've been running a orchestra project in which we interview student veterans. And the question that I wanted to ask is about trauma. I thought Kate and Paul both did a very good job of kind of problematizing that notion. A couple of different arenas we often, I think, sort of have this internal sense that you're really only a veteran if you've gone to war. You're only a veteran if you've been in combat or if you've been deployed. And it seems like there are maybe some hierarchies associated with trauma. And I'm wondering, within the military conversations that you folks have had, if that is seen as a badge of honor, a scarlet letter, or both, and whether or not that's a good thing.
good question.
So I think it's both. I think you walk a tightrope on trying not to be perceived as the ticking time bomb, and then also trying not to be perceived as the hero. I also think that, especially with regards to women, this whole notion of what trauma is worth attention has been internalized. So I'd like to give you a specific example. This woman who participated in my survey, one of the first questions I ask is, why did you get out? And I'd like to read this brief answer. It says, she was a drill sergeant, and she says, I was known as a tough instructor, a young private vexing his naval instructor And so the head of our division of the school assigned this private to me, knowing I wouldn't put up with his shenanigans in class. I cracked down on him, made him do push-ups and stand at parade rest if he was being disruptive. Soon, I was getting phone calls at all hours of the night. They began obscenely, then moved to threats like "I'd like to cut off your breasts so that you bleed to death." And it turns out that this private, it was the private who had done this. The private had a dad who was a command sergeant major, and her commander, a colonel, decided to treat this as a very minor offense. Essentially, he got an Article 15 violation, a slap on the wrist, and she felt betrayed, and so she decided not to re-enlist. Now, that's the second question that I asked. The second to last question that I asked was, do you see your story represented in books, films, lectures? And she said, quote, "My story is not worthy of any of that." And so, taking these two answers, these two questions next to each other, I think that this is a case where she has internalized that her trauma was not valid trauma, her experience was not worth examination or study or being shared with other people. And so I think that's one of the biggest problems that I have seen, is that that tightrope that shouldn't exist in the first place has been so completely internalized by people that unless you are getting the Congressional Medal of Honor for valor on the battlefield, you don't think your story's worth sharing.
Right, there are no medals for sexual assault.
Right.
And, yeah, I mean, without offering names, there are women very close to me who have stories just like that. And it's distressful and troubling. One thing I wanted to get out here, because this question is so relevant to something I wanted to kind of just bring up, is how we talk to veterans. And thankfully, there are programs like yours, sir, and Dr. Ortiz and Kate. You guys are doing this professionally, which is really wonderful. But often in the classroom, teachers, professors, other students don't know how to talk to veterans. So one of the questions I had for everyone I interviewed, including you folks here, but also others, is how would you like to be addressed or to be talked to? And the general sentiment was, as someone put it in another article, don't put veterans on the spot, but do ask questions. And I think it depends so much on the context of where and the kinds of institutions where veterans are getting an education. But Steve, you're absolutely right. I mean, at Weber State, where I went to school as an undergraduate, this was a community of veterans. And so people just sort of knew how to talk to veterans, how to speak to them respectfully, how to allow them to tell their stories without casting them as either villains or heroes, as people who had unique experiences. At a place like Duke, I mean, the only 2 or 3 people that I've known who were connected to the military were mid-career officers. I've never met an enlisted person or formerly enlisted person. I have heard people ask questions that are, I mean, like the one question you don't ask veterans, some variation of, did you hurt someone, or did you see someone get hurt? People just sort of have these impulses, and they really are trying to learn from veterans. But often at certain institutions, it's just so, in certain communities and cultures, it's so foreign to people because because we were so separated from the reality of war that people just don't have any sense of how to actually talk to veterans.
Well, and they assume that if you're talking to a female veteran, that the answers to the questions they ask won't be as horrifying as they could be. Front lines no longer exist in modern day warfare, and so I cannot tell you how many times I have been asked, how many dead people did you see? How many people did you kill? Or even worse, tell me about the worst day of your combat experience. And to me, it's always been, you're asking me that because you think that you can handle the answer because I'm a woman. And so, you know, I would like to warn folks against that, just because you can't make those assumptions anymore.
I've got a question about where we place these discussions in the survey and in our coursework. I feel like all people in this room find places to insert these conversations whenever we can. But from my perspective, we at KHS have been trying to create some resources for survey classes for undergrad education. And we're quite frankly having a tough time convincing people to put them into their syllabi. And because it's not worth it, do you do it at the time the war is discussed? Do you do it a generation later? If you do it a generation later, then what do you bump from your very packed thing? So I think this is maybe a bigger sort of question about, I think all of us here, by virtue of having come to this panel, find ways to do that. How do we convince that part of this conference to start bringing up these conversations?
I have 20 DVDs here of the play I mentioned to begin with, called Telling Gainesville. And as Kate can attest, in terms of doing oral histories, one of the great things about the way that we do oral histories now is that we do them, they're almost classroom ready. They're born digital. At the oral history program at UF, we even create lesson plans to help teachers, K through 12 teachers, but also college instructors as well, incorporate veterans' narratives into larger stories. I think Steve gave us a really good kind of provocative thing to think about, and one way to incorporate veterans' experiences into a survey could be to pose this question that Steve posed to us: what does it mean to fight a multi-generational war, when most wars in U.S. American history have been, time delimited, if you will. But I think oral history, and a colleague from the Library of Congress, I'm sure can talk about this as well. We have more resources now that make it possible to really kind of blend veterans' histories into the classroom. I encourage folks to think about performance pieces as one venue to do this. Now, if you teach oral history, performance is really is a thing now. And we have Cal State Fullerton does a performance seminar where students, and this is not necessarily military, it could be my colleague Natalie Fasikas, who's on council with the Oral History Association, will pick a special topic for her students every semester, and they'll go out and interview individuals, and they'll come back to the classroom and they'll actually perform their oral histories or those experiences. With Telling Gainesville, it was a different model. It was doing the oral histories, getting a playwright, and the playwright working with veterans, and then the veterans getting on stage and actually presenting their narratives, which are incredibly compelling. But those are just a few thoughts. We have a lot of oral history programs now. Certainly, you're welcome to look at what we do at the Proctor program, and that's material that it's ready to go. One of the stories, we just had a veteran, World War II veteran, who just passed away, Frank Towers. He was 98 years old. He was in the combat engineer unit that liberated a trainload of Jewish children who were being shipped to a death camp. And Mr. Towers actually, for the rest of his life, made it his life goal to reconnect with these children as they grew older. And we also did an interview for the Holocaust Museum in Tel Aviv about this. And that's a story which people find incredibly powerful. I mean, that's a World War II story which a lot of our students and faculty would never even think about. You know, again, the ongoing cost of war, the trauma of being a Holocaust survivor, the trauma of being a veteran who is connected to the Holocaust. So there are, I think, a lot of different ways.
Yeah, especially, so you asked specifically how to introduce it into the survey. I think the easy answer is as often as possible, right? So, and it's so easy to do that. So this nation is forged in warfare. Our very first president is a veteran. It's worth reminding people of that. Land grants given to veterans after every single war pushed the boundaries westward. And so you've got combat veterans shaping and playing statecraft, deciding what America's going to look like, what bureaucracy is going to serve. And so you can bring up, I think that's the most important part. If you talk about the lost cause without talking about veterans, then you're missing the point of the lost cause. If you talk about lynching after World War I without talking about black veterans who fought in World War I, then you're not capturing everything, you're not providing the full story. And so, you know, I'm teaching a class this semester that I built for comps on the American veteran from the Revolution through the Bonus Army, and it's essentially following the US survey model, but I'm focusing on the people who enlisted, served, and then their experiences as they transition back to, but you know, I forget the author, but there was a book published a few years ago called 60 Million Acres. And the veterans of the War of 1812 and the Mexican-American War were essentially handed 60 million acres of Western land. And so, you know, to not bring up veteran contribution throughout American history is to kind of miss the point of the American narrative, because this is a war machine country. We have been at war almost constantly since we've been created, and so there's always a veteran generation to study and how they've shaped the American landscape.
To build off that, I think part of the answer to your question is it's a structural problem within the profession, right? So we compartmentalize various genres of history, right? So we typically shop this off to the military historians, wherever they are. No one knows where they are. They're studying a war somewhere. But I think it's much easier than that, right? It's always there, right? So if you're talking about citizenship, you can bring in veteran experiences. If you're talking about democracy, veteran experiences, imperialism. So I think it depends on like your focus, right? You can choose to focus one way, but you can also use veteran experiences to sort of ask broader questions about these larger issues that all historians or many historians are interested in. You know, I love reading Ernie Pyle when I do World War II, right? Because he humanizes the veteran experience. Or, you know, if you have, I don't know, 5 hours, Deer Hunter, right? Or parts of Deer Hunter, because it tells a very impactful story about returning veterans from Vietnam, even if you break it up. But other like journals and primary sources from returning veterans, or even journalistic accounts. You know, there's a film, Restrepo. It wasn't a very good film, but like things of that nature, I think you can easily, or with some work, you can bring those sort of questions and material into the survey without having sort of a military week, you know? I don't know. Or maybe if you can, and you can, I guess it just depends on the professor, how you want to focus your class.
Well, I think also, the National Endowment for the Humanities just finished. We had a year of the Latino experience in America, and many of our oral history programs participated in that. And that was keyed into a year-long PBS series on Latino history in the U.S., and in the middle of that was World War II. And these issues that Stephen, Kate, and Eladio are bringing up, citizenship. So for Latino Americans, World War II was a turning point, and we created the American GI Forum, became a very important civil rights organization. We had really no claim on citizenship. Our claims on citizenship were very weak. And so military service became one of those hinges of citizenship. We didn't have wealth, we didn't have connections, many of us were recent immigrants, but World War II was a very important turning point, especially when you have young men and women returning in caskets who are refused burial in predominantly white cemeteries, and that creates a tremendous upheaval and a consciousness. Okay, well, we fought for you guys, and now you still, segregate us. Kate mentioned World War I and lynching, the lynching of black men in uniforms, which occurred in the aftermath of the Civil War. It occurred in the aftermath of World War II. And so these are ways I think you can really, without too much of a stretch, incorporate veterans' experiences into any course, really. Questions? Yes.
Yeah, hi, I'm Megan Harris. I work with the Veterans History Library Congress, and we're responsible for Dr. Ortiz's law history as well as others around the country. And I thank you for this wonderful panel. I was really struck by Kate's comments about representation and the female combat veterans not feeling seen or heard in popular culture, and also by the female veteran who quoted who didn't feel like her story was worth being told or being listened to. And I wondered about the experience of oral history and the act of interviewing and the act of both telling a story as well as listening to it, and how that might impact a sense of being heard, seen, and listened to. Obviously, this is somewhat of a loaded question because I have vested interest in the act of interviewing being worthwhile, important, and of impact to the veteran, but I wondered if you could say anything, or anyone else who has experience with oral histories.
Absolutely. So the gentleman who runs the Student Veteran Resource Center at the University of Georgia, his name is Ted Barco. He was in the Air Force for 23 years. He worked at the Pentagon on September 11th and helped evacuate the bodies. And so he is very committed to preserving the stories. And it is literally a three-person team between him, myself, and the oral historian who works at Special Collections, and I've done all the interviews so far, and it has been personally life-changing. The concept of 6 degrees of separation, you have no idea how many people who I have sat in a room with, and then we figure out that we know the same people from 15 years ago. And then Ted has told me that after every single history that I've conducted, they reach out to him and say, this was very therapeutic. One woman who I interviewed, she told me after I hit the stop button, she said, I have not talked about my military experience for 15 years. Like she hadn't. And, it's a very informal setting. I have a list of questions, but that's just in case it gets stunted. It's mostly just a 45-minute conversation that we're having. And she said that it had been well over a decade since anyone had asked her anything. Her family had already heard the stories. And that she got emotional after I hit the stop button because it had just been so long. And I found also that It's one of the only places on campus, because I do the interviews at the Student Veteran Resource Center, that's one of the only places where all of these veterans feel like they can talk about their experience. They feel self-censored in the classroom. They are generally, older than the average UGA student, so they're not going to tailgates and they're not hanging out and, playing ping pong in the rec center or whatever. They don't have the same shared history with the typical UGA student, but you walk into the Veteran Resource Center and it's just a place to exhale and relax, and then on top of that, being able to preserve their story in perpetuity. It's a meaningful moment for them, I think.
I would just second, real quick, I would just second oral history is a fantastic methodology and I think we should encourage undergraduate students to go out into the communities, not necessarily just military history, but Eladio and I sort of worked on a project 2 summers ago, Civil Rights in Black and Brown, and we went out across Texas to interview former activists about their experiences in sort of activism, social justice, labor, and we recorded their stories. And you're absolutely right, it was so cathartic for many of them because they weren't able to, or they hadn't been able to sort of express a lot of issues that had been built up, what it means to be Jim Crowed for if you're an elderly black man in East Texas or West Texas. And so I'm just a huge fan of oral history.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Good morning. My name is Earl Brown. A little bit different approach. I teach high school, United States history in suburban Maryland. And as a high school teacher, I feel it's very important. You asked the question, how do we teach war? I feel a particular obligation to teach war honestly to my students, so that if they go off to enlist or be drafted, they know what they're going to. But many of my students, because of where I teach in the DC suburbs, they're Defense Department families and military families. On September 11th, a lot of my students that day, their parents were in So I find a lot of constantly look over my shoulder as I try to teach war honestly. And I feel like you all bring a very important perspective because you kind of have your foot in both camps. So I'm wondering how do we maybe bridge this gap a little bit? Maybe you could advise me, how do we teach history honestly, especially to military families, defense families?
Yeah. I mean, I think growing up in a military, as a kid, the Vietnam War was a personal thing. We had men and women in our neighborhoods who were identified as people who, came home in body bags, literally. And it was not a distant kind of experience. Everyone's a DOD family in my hometown, although Bremerton is much smaller than your community. But I think the way I try to engage it is through the notion, and at some point Eladio, Kate, and Steve all alluded to this, the idea of the cost of war. And this is something that, regardless of your opinion about the US military or imperialism or what have you, reminding people about the cost of war becomes a kind of adjoining narrative. What I mean by this is that one of the activities that I've tried to bring into my classrooms, and actually a lot of our high school teachers in Gainesville have been able to incorporate, is an event we do every Memorial Day called the Memorial Mile. And this is through Gainesville Veterans for Peace. And we set up tombstones that are dedicated to each service member who was killed in either the war in Afghanistan or the war in Iraq. This year we're up to nearly 7,000 of those. These are officially designated from the DoD statistics. And initially there was some discomfort because, this is a mile of tombstones. You can Google this, and it's pretty amazing. We have veterans and families and comrades of fallen service people who visit us from all over the country. And it's very political in a certain way, but we try to not talk politics so much, except for we want to make sure we know where every tombstone is. Family members come out, we can take them directly to the tombstone. They will bring memorabilia. Comrades will often come actually during the evenings, often because they don't want a lot of attention. They'll bring a beer, or they'll leave, a medal or something like that. But I mention this because I think that notion of the cost of war allows people from different backgrounds and different perspectives to kind of come together. And even I'll call my colleagues, my comrades, some of my pro-war veteran friends really take to the Memorial Mile because they see their experiences and their perspectives being honored in that kind of exercise. And we've tried to bring this into classrooms. And although it happens, over Memorial Day weekend, a lot of teachers now bring their students to that, and they just walk, and it's a whole mile, but we have this recorded now on YouTube. You can actually get the experience of driving or walking down this long, mile-long row of tombstones.
I'm a big fan of, again, oral histories. If you can get, and I think kids are really interested in speaking to their grandparents or their uncles, people they know, and I think most of us know someone who's a veteran or who's touched by war in some way. So I think having speakers is really useful, and you have to gauge, what kind of speaker you want, and then depending on what grade you teach, who can handle what. I'm also a big fan of using fiction. I don't know how the rest of you feel about this, but I love using fiction in historical teaching. Again, considering who you're teaching and how, the age and grade or those types of things. But using texts like Don Trumbo's Johnny Got His Gun or Joseph Heller's Catch-22 are profoundly effective in a lot of discussions about war and about veterans issues. So I'm a fan of injecting oral histories, of course, but also fiction where I can, and then treating them as texts, as historical texts, and getting young people to talk about how these texts came to be and what they say about our culture and what they say about the military experience, about war, about citizenship.
Just to add on to that, beyond fiction, I think that there's a lot of underutilized memoirs out there. You've got Company H from the Civil War, you've got Lanterns on the Levee for World War I, and all of these offer the follow-through, right? Not just the wartime experience, but then what happens after. And I think that's one of the big things, is not to focus solely on those who died, but to also remember that most lived, came home, and then did something, right? So demonstrating that transition and that further contribution of service in whatever form it might have taken. I think that memoirs are a good way to demonstrate that on a case-by-case level.
Comments or questions? The panel, do we have any kind of closing wrap-up thoughts that folks want to share?
A lot of you.
I'm just grateful for all of you who came and heard us talk about what we obviously think is a really important issue. Unfortunately, I don't think in the near future, veterans will cease to be. So I think we have a long way to go in understanding veterans' issues, in understanding how we can best serve them and how we can learn from them, and how we can incorporate questions of war, citizenship, sacrifice into our discussion. So I'm just really grateful for you folks agreeing to be on this panel and for all of you coming and giving us some great questions and comments to think about and carry on as we move forward.
Oh, well, I'll just say veterans are people, right? And so if they're in your class, in your classrooms, use them as a resource, just like any other. I mean, you got to be conscious of the sorts of questions you ask and how you frame the questions. And you definitely don't want to sort of like, if you have one veteran, sort of make that person a representative of all veterans. But ask them questions about their experiences if it relates to the subject that you're teaching that day. If they're, and I guess most professors are good at this, gauging like if they're the type of student that is open to talking about their experiences. I mean, some of it's you got to intuit, but in general, I think from my own experience, I think students love to hear. Whether it's civil rights activism, your time in the military, or your experience in war, they love to hear first-person accounts of those experiences. It makes, it connects the history in the text with like real-life experience. It makes it more real for them. So use them as a resource.
Well, thank you, everyone. Please give our panelists another round of applause. And again, I have DVDs telling Gainesville. It's very powerful. Brochures. We'd love to give them away, actually. So also, I will be doing a book signing. I have a new book called An African American and Latinx History of the United States, 2 p.m. at the Penguin Book Exhibit. I'll be signing free copies. So if you want a free copy of a book, come in and I'll see you again. Thank you very much.